When I first heard of Ripout, I was initially intimidated. It's because it's meant to be a co-op experience. Not really being big into co-op games nowadays, I figured I wouldn't be able to play, but that changed when I was told I could still play it on my own. I expected things to be balanced and to more or less offer the same experience as if I were playing with someone else, but that wasn't the case. That's something I'll eventually discuss. From the start, I thought it looked great for an indie game. I realize that may come off as slightly insulting, but it's because the majority of indie games I play aren't known for getting close to reaching AAA gaming visuals. The games I play manage to look visually appealing in various sorts of ways, but not in the way that Ripout does. What I particularly enjoyed about the visual impressiveness is that its attention to detail made me want to explore every nook and cranny. At first, there wasn't much to going out of your way, mainly because it just resulted in more crafting materials than I'd ever expect to use, but over time things changed. I assume that it's because Ripout is currently a work in progress, so updates were being made as I played it for nearly 2 months. Despite noticing that the color palette's more or less the same in each level, there's a lot of variety when it comes to them. A lot of thought went into the level design, and as I previously mentioned, that didn't always result in bonus items, but it still left you wanting to explore just for the hell of it. I like that because gaming doesn't always need a reward/prize. Sometimes just taking things in and appreciating them for what they are is enough. It's kind of how there are movies out there that aren't narratively deep or even just straight up bad, but they still have a lot to offer when it comes to the visuals, so on that level you can still appreciate something. While I do believe that a game doesn't always need a reward/prize in order for me to think of it as good, there were multiple moments where I needed additional supplies and I didn't get them. Simply put, I wish the game had more ammo and health instead of crafting materials. Seeing as how this game isn't complete, it's understandable to see why this and other areas of the game could be perceived as imbalanced, but it made my experience with Ripout harder than it needed to be. I played on normal, and yet with how often I died, it felt as if I were really playing on a higher difficulty setting. That issue went hand in hand with the enemies in combat. Though the enemies in Ripout were fairly limited, I liked what I saw of them. I also liked that there were clear weak spots that could be targeted to greatly affect the enemy. Most of the time I couldn't take advantage of this, seeing as how things could get pretty hectic, but the moments where I was able to, I was left satisfied. For some reason, I expected Ripout to be a horde-based kind of game. I was expecting to face wave after wave of enemies, but that didn't happen. Instead, you'd end up stumbling into enemies, or sometimes they'd stumble into you. I'd say it was a mixed bag of how these encounters went. Sometimes it was easy for me to concentrate on 1 or 2 enemies at a time, but there were also moments where I'd have 3 enemies chasing after me. The latter was definitely panic-inducing, but what most annoyed me was how cheap some of the deaths felt. In each mission you had 2 lives. You could be killed once and then revive yourself, but after that was used up and you died, that was it. That's reasonable, but what created a clash was how enemies would suddenly appear out of nowhere. For example, there was one instance where I ran to a mission critical terminal, started using it, and then got attacked by a heavy enemy. Some might say, well, that's on you for not keeping your eyes open, but it left me thinking that I wish Ripout had a radar system to spot enemies. With how the pet gun scanner works to find usable side weapons, I thought the scanner system could implement a radar. I'm sure that some might think that take away from the tension/suspense you feel as a result of never knowing when an enemy might be just around the corner, but it doesn't have to be super precise. It could be like the radar system in Halo where you'd see a red dot in its general direction. The point isn't to make the game easier, but to make it so that things are fairer. Speaking of fair, the gas barrels you'd frequently run into were a great way of helping to give you an edge over the enemies. I loved how the exploding barrels worked, but if I'm being honest, they were too overpowered. They helped a lot and made it so that I could overcome difficult obstacles, but using them against some of the game's hardest enemies was the equivalent of having a one-hit kill weapon. Despite that, I liked that they were included in Ripout because it allowed me to think strategically. If I knew that I was low on ammo, health, and had a handful of enemies to kill, I could lead them towards the barrel and shoot it once or twice to take them all out. On the other hand, if you were too close to the explosion, you'd get damaged, so using the barrels was like a double-edged sword. Besides the inclusion of gas barrels to help make Ripout more manageable, it was nice to see that it was possible to get both offensive and defensive upgrades. At first, the upgrades were pretty basic, but over time, they became rarer and more useful. At the same time, there were occasions where I noticed that the upgrades weren't as common as they used to be. Most of the time I tried to stick to the offensive upgrades because that's where I was having the most difficulty, but if I saw that I was low on health or was far from completing a mission, I'd get upgrades that increased how quickly my running speed would regenerate, that allowed me to take less damage, and that simply allowed me to play how I would have liked to have been able to from the start. And bringing up my experience with being far from completing some missions, It's worth mentioning that Ripout tried to do too much with them. They were like marathons and I'd just keep dying and dying. Since the missions would change every time I died, I felt like I wasn't making any progress at all. I learned what to do and how to avoid situations that plagued me early on, but I wasn't seeing the results I wanted to. It also didn't help that sometimes your objectives weren't as clear as they could have been. There were objective markers, but occasionally I'd be in front of where it was pointing to, but I was still left wondering what was next. That was especially bothersome when some of the missions included a time limit. That did a hell of a job at making me feel tense, and it also didn't help that sometimes I'd be racing against the clock while also trying to avoid enemies. Ripout isn't impossibly hard, but from what I got to experience, it's clear that this game is meant to be played with an additional player. It's possible to play on your own, but there's too much that makes that harder than you'd expect it to be. It also bothered me that I was expected to beat a mission in one play session. Like I previously mentioned, some of the missions were more like marathons, so I was hoping to be able to save and continue at a later point. I know it's an early version of Ripout, but I wasn't sure if you could save, or if you had to fully complete a mission before the game would save. Seeing as how I didn't complete a single mission for an extended period of time, I felt pretty lost while I was first getting familiarized with Ripout. I eventually noticed that there were resurrection stations, and that made me think that the save/continue system would be handled like it was in Bio/System Shock, but at this point I'm still not clear about that. The fact that I beat a couple of missions and yet still didn't know how much of this version of Ripout was left is one of the reasons why this is a preview video, rather than a full review. I got a lot from playing it, and I'm confident in saying that I was able to see much of what it had to offer. Still, I didn't want to keep playing it to keep running into the same issues over and over again, so when I realized that I didn't know if the game in its current state could be beaten, I decided to move on. I had my fair share of issues with Ripout, but at the same time, in its current state it's a lot better than some games out there that are considered full releases. It's just a beta preview, but there's a lot to it. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this game is groundbreaking or a must-play, but it offers enough to leave me thinking some will enjoy what it has to offer. I enjoyed its visuals, the level design, and the overall sci-fi elements. Some of the things that I disliked would lead others to not want to give Ripout a try, but if you're a fan of sci-fi based first-person shooters, it's worth keeping an eye open for when the game's fully released, or at least for when a demo is made public. How do you feel about being able to play co-op based games on your own? Should a game have a wide color palette in order to be considered visually impressive? What makes you think of a game as imbalanced when it comes to its difficulty level? If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.